I want to talk about the nature of creation myths because they're so central in this particular series, and in that it is built around the creation myths of the cultures and societies that Cessa passed through on her remarkable journey to Ireland from northern Sudan. Now, creation myths are an important part of every mythology. And what they speak to is how order gets created out of chaos. So they're speaking to essentially that culture's belief about how their world was created. And it's easy to dismiss a creation myth from the perspective of a modern scientific world because in many cases the science it doesn't actually stack up, doesn't make sense. But if you don't look at the story or the creation myth literally, but understand it in a more metaphorical or mythical way, invariably there are some extremely interesting principles that in some ways offer a starting point or a hypothesis about that culture's core belief system and ideology. And from that point of view, it renders these creation myths very interesting. So what we're really saying is view these creation myths not scientifically, but mythically, not literally, but more as a metaphor. So what we then have then is the cultures that we're looking at, creation myths, and the hypothesis that we're working with is that they might be indicative or revealing of ancient and archaic ideologies and belief systems. Now, what tended to happen is that in ancient times, societies, at times when chaos was returning, they tended to revert to these myths again. Now, in other cases, particularly if we take the Babylonian myth that we're going to be looking at, the Enuma Elish, what we learn is that every year that particular society read again the Enuma Elish, and in a way it was sort of reflective of a society that in a way wanted or needed to recreate itself every year. It returned to its myths of foundation. And in the case of the Greek myths, the annual Great Dionysia festival could also be seen as a reverting to the foundation myths as the great tragedians at the great Dionysia, Aeschylus, Euripides, and Sophocles. Yep. They created tragedies and indeed comedies that dealt with what was going on in the society. So that can also be viewed as a return to foundational mythologies. Now, what we then have then in these creation myths is a potential starting point in order to understand the ideology and the belief system of these ancient societies. And that's useful. But bear in mind that it is a hypothesis, and but my experience is that it's more than that. It's a useful starting point. At worst, it would be a useful point from which to stimulate a discussion about the worldview and belief system. But I think it can often be a lot more than that, and surprisingly revealing. Now, the matter of these ancient creation myths was picked up by the controversial Canadian thinker Jordan Peterson, and I've read his book, The Maps of Meaning, and what he talks about it as being architectures of belief. And I think in many ways it's brilliant. I do not accept his conclusions, and I do not accept where he's going, but I think as a means of analysis, I think he's very clever, very brilliant, and he absolutely reverts to these creation myths and points to the connection. What he does do, which I find problematic, is he talks about the dismemberment of the goddess in Tiamat by Marduk as an exemplary myth. And I think that's, in many cases, could be seen as a foundation for a particular worldview that makes him extremely controversial. But a lot more of that on the program. But what we're essentially doing, using the perspective of Cesair, is saying she would have experienced all these creation myths, and given her particular narrative, she would have surely had a very questioning view, and given that she was had no place on Noah's Ark and she set off to start again, we've clearly got a very interesting perspective from which to look at the creation myths of Western culture and ask ourselves, where would Cesair have gone? What would she have picked up? What would she have wanted to do? Because essentially, her choice when she was faced with the ultimate rejection by the family, by the grandfather, there's no place for you on the ark, which basically meant you will die. And she didn't act poor me or supplicate herself to get on the ark. She said, well, we're going to start again. And she got her people together and she built 3 arks. And she set off to start again in Ireland. So I think from that perspective, we've got a very strong foundation from which to view the creation myths of Western culture. And that's the purpose of the program. But I did want in this particular intro to say a little bit more about the nature of creation myths.